start with a little ceremony. As most of you know, Bob was in the Air Force, and there's a special military flag ceremony we're going to begin with.
What size bullet does that take? There.
Side.
Again, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out. I want to thank those servicemen for honoring Bob.
Thank you.
So, my name's Tony Heriza. Bob was one of my two big brothers. He was almost 13 years older, so we didn't really grow up together, but he loomed very large in my life. You know, from the beginning when I was, 3 or 4 years old. There's some photos up here you can follow if you want to look at later that you can't see too much from the back, but he, he was just at that point where he cast an enormous, not a shadow in a negative sense, but he was a kind of role model for me as he graduated from high school and went to the Air Force Academy. So it's a privilege for me to be able to talk to you about that experience. I encourage you to read the obituary that's in that little pamphlet, and I'm going to expand on it just a little bit. Because, and then I do want to say that several other people are going to have some words about Bob, and we're going to then invite any of you who'd like to reminisce or tell a story about Bob to share some thoughts. On the way in, I ran into one of my nephews, and we were talking about how everyone has many sides, but my brother Bob was unusual in the number of different aspects of his life that people may have encountered and not known about others. So we're going to try to fill in some of those blanks. Bob was a unique and a pretty unconventional individual. I think you might agree. You may have noticed I'm not wearing conventional funeral attire. That's in honor of Bob. Bob was not known for wearing appropriate attire. He was never afraid to be himself, and I think that was a good thing for the most part. There may have been moments, like when he would have lunch with my grandmother and wear shirts that were, no one knew what she thought until one day he wore one that had something to do with the Philharmonic, and she said, Bob, that shirt's much too refined for you. So Bob was not afraid, and his fearlessness is one of the things I want to talk about. I want to talk about fearlessness and courage. They're similar but not the same. So Bob was apparently fearless from a very early age. My mother had some experience already with child rearing when he came along, number 4 of the surviving children, and her earlier children would play in the yard when they were told to, but Bob was a runner. And as soon as she'd go in the house, he was out the fence and down the street. And she tried a number of creative child restraining activities to keep him safe. And my sisters have told me I'm not permitted to elaborate because protective services might still be aware. But she kept him safe. He survived. And but his fearlessness, I think, benefited him, served him quite well through many parts of his life, including he started working with my father. Many of you probably know we had an acreage at the edge of town that my father grew a great deal of what we ate and what paid our tuition and various things. So Bob started very early, and he was learning to drive a tractor when most kids were learning to ride a bike. And he had this kind of sense of his own capacity that, it came in handy. It came in handy when he spent the summer with some of our ranching cousins, the Langleys, out at Rye Valley. He wrote about this in a piece that was published in the Oregonian. He had a great time. They taught him a lot of things, and it was time to go ride for cattle. And he was 10, and they said he could come if he could catch and saddle his own horse. And it took him a number of tries, but he did it. The unfortunate thing was the saddle couldn't be adjusted enough so that his feet fit in the stirrups. so that he was bouncing most of the ride, but as he said, he stayed on the horse and he didn't complain. And that was Bob. So he liked to stretch himself in a lot of different ways. When he was a sophomore in high school, he invited a senior girl out to the prom, and then he borrowed a neighbor's new Cadillac to drive her in, even though he didn't have his driver's license yet. And he got away with it. That was Bob. So I think he had a lot of kinds of courage. He was an athlete. I mean, he was, I mentioned a little more in the obituary, pretty much everything he tried, he was successful at. And so that gave him a position in our family that the joke was, my mother loved all of us equally, except that Bob was her favorite. So anyway, he had a lot of courage, had a lot of confidence, took a certain kind of courage to be a lineman in the football team. He's apparently pretty good at it. But it took another kind of courage to step out on stage in a lead role in the senior play, which he also did. He sang, he danced. He could pretty much push himself to do anything. So I think it also probably took courage, even though I know he was thrilled about it when he was nominated by a congressman to go to the Air Force Academy, the new Air Force Academy. It hadn't even been built yet. He was in the 3rd class. It took courage to go by himself to Colorado Springs and to enroll in what was then being described as the toughest education in the world. Now, whether that was bragging on the part of the Air Force or whether it was true, it was challenging, and it challenged him. He wrote a lot of letters home. My parents had some pretty strict rules. He was supposed to write a letter a week, and he did. And it was a challenge. He was smart, but it was not easy. But he struggled. He graduated, and he went on to pilot training. I suspect that there was, a certain kind of courage to step into a cockpit of a fighter plane and fly it. He did. He got his wings. He went on to training to be a B-52 pilot. And that's where the story takes a rough turn, because actually the night after the celebration for his B-52 training, he was in an auto accident that was serious enough that he was in a coma for 3 weeks. My mom went down and spent a bit of that time with him. We were all waiting at home. When he woke up, he couldn't speak and he couldn't walk. And one of my most vivid memories is hearing him when he finally came to. He called and he talked to each of us kids at home, and his voice was totally different at that point. But he gradually recovered most of his abilities, but not enough to stay in the Air Force. And so that Air Force dream was over. He was 26 years old, married, already had 1 child, 1 on the way, and he had to totally reinvent himself. So after months of difficult rehabilitation, he went back to school. He went back to DU, University of Denver, and he got his master's in English literature and was hired to teach at a small college in Minnesota, Albert Lee College. And then after that, he went back and was working towards his PhD. Now, I think it probably took most of his friends at that point were still Air Force buddies, so I'm interested what they thought when he said he was working on his PhD and was going to focus on the poetry of Emily Dickinson. But Bob was never one to be swayed by other people's opinions. So, but I've always been interested in the Emily Dickinson's appeal to Bob. And so I found a poem that I wondered this might have been the kind of poem that spoke to him when he was struggling to find his way. I felt my life with both my hands to see if it was there. I held my spirit to the glass to prove it possibler. I turned my being round and round and paused at every pound to ask the owner's name for doubt that I should know the sound. I told myself, take courage, friend. That was a former time, and we might learn to like the heaven as well as our old home. Now, sadly, Bob never finished his dissertation. I don't really know the story. I just know that he went to work for the federal government in Denver and to support a family that had grown by then to 4. And then later, when his marriage ran aground, he moved back to Baker City. And I wonder what that was like, but I think it probably took a certain kind of courage to come back to Baker and a certain kind of humility. He came back, a very different person than as he left. But when he came back, he built a new life, working with people with developmental disabilities. And it was pretty apparent that his own disability helped him not only empathize, but identify with the people that he was working with. And he continued to be fearless, whether it was shooting down the slopes at Anthony Lakes with his adaptive ski gear. Some of you may have seen him, the outriggers and the ski bra connecting his skis, or driving his sports car just a bit too fast around the curves of Dooley Mountain. That's one I'm describing from personal experience. Or, as mentioned before, walking around in downtown Baker City wearing a t-shirt that would make his mother blush. He lived, as they say, to fit his own category. And in Baker City, he found joy. He found joy in his work, in skiing, in searching the hillsides of Eastern Oregon for mushrooms that no one else could find. He found love again with his wife, Judy. He wrote articles and books. He faced life with spirit and kindness and an irrepressible sense of humor. In his last days, when he was in hospice care, I was visiting with him with some of our family members over Zoom, and I was trying to think about what to say or what to do, and so I decided to read him a poem, and it's a poem called Courage by Anne Sexton. Courage. It is in the small things we see it. The child's first step, as awesome as an earthquake. The first time you rode a bike, wallowing up the sidewalk. The first spanking when your heart went on a journey all alone. When they called you crybaby, or poor, or crazy, you smiled and concealed the pain. Later, when you endured a great despair, you did it alone. Getting a transfusion from the fire, picking the scabs off your heart, then wringing it out like a sock. Next, you powdered your sorrow. You gave it a back rub, and then you covered it with a blanket. And after it had slept a while, it woke to the wings of roses and was transformed. Now, as you face old age and its natural conclusion, your courage is still shown in the little ways as you bargain with the calendar. But at the last moment, when death opens the back door, you'll put on your carpet slippers and stride out. And that's what Bob did the next morning. So, now I'd like to invite a number of people who were close to Bob to say a few words, and we'll start with my other big brother, John. Or we could bring you the mic, if that's better.
I'm walking down here, so.
Well, I'm the elder of the three Heriza, John, and Bob and I weren't buddies. And the main reason was when in 1951, when he was in the 7th grade, I enlisted in the Navy for 4 years during the Korean War. So we didn't run around a lot. But over the years, since that time, we had close ties in a lot of areas, and I just want to hit 2 or 3 of them. Tony only bothered one of them. Gardening is an area where we had some relationships. We started weeding for my dad on the 7-acre plot out here across from Settlers Park. The reason we had 7 acres is my dad was trying to raise 7 kids, or 8, 7, I guess, on that salary, and it wouldn't work, so we raised everything on that 7 acres, and the first thing that we ever learned to do was to weed when we got old enough. And later on, after we moved back from Pendleton here, Bob and I started a 6-year partnership on gardening at the back of Judy's home there on 4th Street, and we continued that until we got so bad that when we kneeled down, neither one of us could get up. And so we finally had to quit that, decided that, we had to have something to pull ourselves up, or we just laid out there among the weeds. The other area where we, back when all of us were at home, we sold Christmas trees. That's how the kids got the money to buy Christmas presents for each other. And we had an old 36 Ford sedan. My dad didn't believe in chains, and Ebell Creek wasn't really plowed out that much. So we'd go and we got stuck, and then we'd pull ourselves out, or if we couldn't get out, the chains went on. But anyway, we sold trees, and we 25 cents to 75 cents was the general amount, but when we had a good one, we sold it for $1. But one year Dad found a tree probably almost 9 feet tall and just beautiful. And he put a tag of $2 1/4 on it. A local doctor, whose name I will not give you now, he's not deceased anyway, but he bought the tree, but not before he got my dad out in the yard and told him he thought he was a robber for charging that much for a Christmas tree. And we also, that was when we got introduced to the mushroom country. And then coming back to what Brother Tony said before, in 1955, Bob was a sophomore, and Bob, like he said, found a nice senior girl, and he asked her to the prom, and I don't think he might have had a learner's permit, but I knew he didn't want to drive our family car. I think it was a 49 Chevy with not too much, with all the kids riding in it, cracked windows and things that didn't work. But I had just got, in February of 55, I had just been discharged from the Navy. And I actually was 7 years into an 11-year courtship of a lady named Liz Vaughn. And unbeknownst to me, Bob goes to her mother without telling me what he's gonna do, talks her into lending him the old light blue Cadillac. So that was and then during the time that Bob, I was his best man at his wedding at the Air Force Academy, and he was my best man here, but when in 1960, we went to, Liz and I went to California, and we stopped at Travis Air Base and took Bob out for the first time that he'd left in about 4 months. He'd been in the hospital, and we took him to San Francisco to the comedy club, kind of like the Improv Comedy Club that night. And then more recently, since we moved back to Baker, Bob's daughter Suzanne died, and I don't know why he put her ashes where he did. It's about a quarter of a mile from Lily White. Thanks to I got a little Joe Biden in me, so anyway, Lily White, and then we bought a cabin when we were in Pendleton, about a mile and a half down the road from Lily White, and Bob put her ashes up there in a little leather bag with a string and tied it to a tree, and the Forest Service had marked it, and we felt it wouldn't be logged. And 3 years ago, or anyway, what we did then, on the 3rd of May, her death, Bob had a special order for some Czech Slisowicz, and we would drive up there and give a toast, have a drink, and then look for mushroom. Well, if you saw the picture on the internet of him with a little paper cup, 3 years ago we did that, and then Forest Service wiped us out. So her ashes are no longer there. Anyway, so then this April, Bob came up to the cabin with us and looking for mushrooms, and we had a flat place, probably no bigger than this room, and he got this cane incident that he recommended that I get it. I don't fall down quite. But within 30 minutes, Pat and Heather and their 2 kids were up there with us, and he got a dozen mushrooms or so. So in closing, I've decided that next May the 3rd, if I'm still vertical, I'm going to go up, I'm going to get the Slisowicz and toast them both. Thank you.
Now, a couple of my sisters wanted to say a word here, and we're not able to make it from Portland, so we're going to read their words. So Catherine, I think, is maybe going to start with Claire.
I'm gonna go over.
Go. Art.
First?
I guess we should have got an egg order.
No, that was my dad's brother.
Hi,
And you're who?
I am Catherine Heriza de Phillips, Bob's
Can't hear you
niece,
very well.
but I am speaking for my Aunt Claire Heriza, who couldn't be here in person. So here goes. I am now Claire. I'm Claire, one of Bob's 3 younger sisters, along with Mary Kay and Beth. Unfortunately, Beth and Mary Kay have both passed away in the last few years. But I am including their memories in what I want to say about Bob today.
Never fell.
There are 2 areas where Bob had a lasting impact on our lives. The first is related to the best Christmas present ever, And the second is what he taught us by example, how to deal with loss. A few years after Bob left home, he sent us a Christmas present which thrilled and amazed us. Jazz pianist Ahmad Jamal's album, Poinciana? We had never heard anything like it and listened again and again. We had been exposed to a broad range of music through St. Francis Academy and KBKR, but this was absolutely new. This was an invitation to step into the dreamy, transporting experience of smooth instrumental jazz. I lived with Mary Kay for several years until she could not be cared for at home. One of our favorite activities was cooking together, often in silence, but always with Ahmad Jamal in the background. Bob had a special connection with his youngest sister, Beth. At age 19, Beth traveled by herself to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She was seeking a diagnosis for a year of swollen knees, pain, and fatigue. After days of testing, she was told that she had rheumatoid arthritis. As a last step before discharge, Beth was to meet with a physical therapist who would explain the condition and advise her how to manage it. Beth told me that she can't remember anything after the therapist walked in and asked, "Are you ready to sit down for the rest of your life?" Fortunately, Bob was there to pick her up. He was teaching at Albert Lee College and lived just an hour away. Neither Bob nor Beth were big talkers when it came to expressing feelings. Years later, she told me, Bob saved me. He told her about his brain injury and what he tried to do to recover. He talked about how he was trying to forget about his losses and live his life fully and optimistically. Bob went on to write Recovery from Traumatic Brain Injury, a Self-Help Primer. And Beth certainly didn't stay sitting down for the rest of her life.
So I think now we're going to have Pat is going to read what my sister Celeste wrote and maybe say a few words himself.
What'd you say your name was? Higgin?
Got this on my phone, so let me just. Okay. Not very good at puns. Trying to sideways one. There we go. Okay. So I'm Pat Heriza, youngest, or not, second to youngest John, and Uncle Bob and Aunt Celeste, so I'm reading for Celeste. And this is a bit about mushrooming with Bob. After I moved back to Portland in the late 1990s, I started going with Bob on Memorial Day weekends. We kept this up most of the years, I gotta get a little smaller, hold on. Most of the years until COVID struck. Even though I was in my 80s and Bob not far behind, Bob was an expert on Eastern Oregon mushrooms and knew every byway in the Elkhorns where they could be found. Since I knew nothing about the area, he always explained the terrain to me and kept me within earshot, so I wouldn't get lost and fall into a ravine. We usually found morels because it was a bit late for calf brains. Some years we found a lot, some years just a few, but we always had fun. These trips also served as memorials to Dad, the original mushroom hunter, and Bob would always bring a Louis lunch that included head cheese. He often brought Slivovitz, too, along with little shot glasses so we could toast Louis before going back to Baker. This is one of my favorite events of the year. That's from Celeste. So I can say a few words too. I spent a lot of time, they were usually periodic episodes with my dad kids, Heather, anyone else that was around. But a lot of times it was around mushrooming, and we would head up to the cabin, and he was just always fun to be around. Positive energy. He definitely, the last trip, I'm really glad we made the effort to get a hold of Bob and say, do you want to go on another mushrooming outing? Because I know he was just, movement wasn't real solid at that point. And so we got him in, we loaded him in with Dad in the back seat of my Suburban, which was kind of a task. We had to kind of help get his legs in. We got him in, and he was great. They had a great conversation. We went up to the cabin, and what was funny about it is my kids, there's one hot spot that everyone knows about, and they got out and beat him to it, because I was helping get Bob out and get Dad out, and we had everyone go in different directions. And they went through, and they found maybe one or two, but not many. And then they went off to some other spots. And Bob, with his walker, got up, we got his walker set up. He has a little bag that kind of hung off his leg, and a knife that also hung down, so he could kind of get down to cut the mushroom. And he started just heading out through what was the hot spot, which he'd hit many times in the past. And about a half hour later, I was kind of bouncing between my dad and Bob to make sure both of them were still upright. And then they came back around, and he had at least a dozen in his little bag of mushrooms. So then we sat down and had a toast to everyone who's passed away. It's kind of a ritual, and I'd also been to many of the events to toast Suzanne up in this particular spot in the woods. So I'm gonna miss Bob. He's a good guy. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Kind of working our way through John's kids here. Richard is gonna say a word or two and also read something that unfortunately neither of Bob's kids, Jeff or Chris, could be here, but Chris wrote something that he sent from Colorado.
Thanks everybody for coming today. I'm Richard, I'm the oldest son of John. This is Chris's letter. Chris Heriza, Bob's oldest son. Bob Heriza, or Pops, as I fondly referred to him, was an extremely intelligent, enigmatic man with such a sly wit that if you were not paying close attention, it might slip right past. In my early years after my parents split, I spent some days with him camping, skiing, playing cards, and listening to Jim Croce in his Honda CBCC with an airplane stenciled on each door. That was pure Bob. Come on, who has an airplane stenciled on the doors of their compact car? He was one of the smartest people I knew back then and to this day. He told me some good and often complicated jokes and impressed people with his depth of knowledge. He also taught me about limericks, and I memorized many of them. Quote, there once was a man from Nantucket. Maybe I shouldn't tell you that one right now. At this point in my life, I have a lot of information in my head that I often share with my wife, what she calls useless info, but I call it smarts. I also love words and consider myself a wordsmith of sorts. I think this must be a trait passed on to me from him. Bob was a kind man, loved by many. I am sure wherever he is now, he's making someone laugh and teaching them about something that they had never heard. Love you, Pops, your son, Chris. Do you mind if I read your letter, Judy, that I sent you?
Oh, I love it.
Okay. This is a letter I sent to Judy a couple days after Bob died. It really struck me because Pat had just told me about this mushrooming experience, and I'm like, now the man is dead. Dear Judy and family, a friend of mine recently said to me, Richard, life is precious. It immediately struck me that this feeling sums up our human existence pretty succinctly, and it is also what makes the death of people we love so gut-wrenching. Bob was a wonderful man who understood the preciousness of life deep in his bones. His loving nature and kind treatment of others were partly born out of the fact he had experienced and overcome some very tough times. But despite the sorrows and disappointments he dealt with, he kept a sense of humor and love of life. Judy, you were always very supportive of Bob, and I know he greatly appreciated your love and companionship. It was obvious to all who knew you two that you were a great match, and it was a delight to watch you tease each other and laugh at each other's jokes. Judy, you're a remarkable lady who has also endured significant adversity with grace and humor. I don't think Bob or you have an enemy in this world, and that is some feat given the capriciousness of people. I know Scott, Craig, Stephanie, Chris, Jeff, Jackie, the grandkids, extended family members, and lifelong friends feel your loss deeply and will do whatever they can to ease your burdens. I try to constantly remind myself that most people attempt to do their best given their particular circumstances and the unpredictable nature of life. I wish I could have done more in the past weeks to help you and the family. I can't help but think that Bob was another person who fell victim to an incredibly disjointed and in some ways cruel medical system. And then I just said, love Richard, Heriza, and family. I have a few thoughts. I won't belabor it about Bob. A lot of it's already been stated. All I could think about when I heard Bob had passed away was time flies and life sure is fleeting. This morning I reread the letters that Bob sent home to his parents and siblings during his 4 years at the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he commenced in 1957. That's in the book, Man's Flight Through Life. I enjoyed the letters, and I was intrigued by the many times that Bob, he would get a poor grade, but then he would just remedy it. Like the next week, he'd say, I'm from 74 to 85. I'm going to pass. And he kept saying that. And then he said he got out of minor infractions without too much punishment. I don't know how he did it. He was at the Air Force Academy. And then he avoided the eye color test like 3 or 4 times, and you have to pass that to be a pilot, but somehow he'd finagle a way out of it. And and then he also was able to mix a lot of fun in at the Air Force Academy. It sounded like he was having a lot of fun on the off days. One of the first realizations of the tragic misfortune that befell Bob that we all know about occurred when I was about 12 years old. I found a copy of the U.S. Air Force magazine in the living room at my grandma's house on 9th Street, and on the cover was a picture of Bob looking handsome as he could be, and he was all decked out in his U.S. Air Force dress blues with a sword on his left side. I thought to my 12-year-old self, this guy was a hell of a man and the real deal, and he accomplished all this in only 4 years after leaving his hometown of Baker, Oregon. I'll never forget that picture. I have known Uncle Bob mostly as an older man with a white beard, enjoying his life and his cronies in his hometown of Baker City. He always had a good joke, and I remember his hearty laugh. He kept up on the happenings of the world, and he was always ready to head out to the mountains for snow skiing and any kind of forest bathing. Bob never lost his love for life or adventure, despite the many hardships he endured. A few years ago, at a family reunion at Mary Kay Eiler's cabin near Welch's and near Mount Hood, we were all sitting around drinking beer, and he said, I'll never forget it. He said, I just lost my place. My eyes are bad. Well, yeah, here it is. He said, I always tried to turn the lemons that life gave me into lemonade. And in my mind, Bob exemplifies the famous passage of one of my favorite Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, who said, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. It's my favorite quote of all time. And that exemplifies Bob. There's no doubt in my mind. One more quote from Marcus Aurelius, who said, when you arise in the morning, think what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, to love. I love Bob, and I know many other people did too, for he was a thoughtful, courageous, and unique human being. I guess that's it. Thank you, everybody.
All right, now we get to hear directly about some of those Air Force experiences. One of Bob's roommates, actually his first roommate, they roomed together several years, sent a letter, and Scott Brookhart's going to read it for us.
good to see many of you. I haven't seen you in quite a while. I'm Scott Brookhart, stepson of Bob Heriza and son of Judy. This is a story from Pat Buckley. Pat was a roommate at the Air Force Academy. Okay, sure. So I actually had never met Pat, so this will be interesting. I just saw the letter not long ago. We first met as classmates in 2nd Squadron as we survived the first 2 months of maximum physical and mental stress, settled into our first academic year squadrons, 1957-1958. Bob and I were fated to share the next 4 years in the same squadron together. My first enduring memory is Bob and I were teammates on the 2nd Squadron intramural football team. We were only scored on once with a record of 6 wins and 1 tie to be wing champs and in a few nights of relaxed dining. Bob was our left defensive back, and one opponent made it around our left and headed to the goal line when Bob, our left defensive back, appeared and made an energetic tackle to preserve our win and champions title. A first look at Bob's determination to win. The next memories of Bob and I were roommates during our 3rd academic year, 1959-60. During the end of the 59 year, our Air Force Academy team was scheduled to play the University of Colorado as clear underdogs. Some of us hatched a plot to visit the Colorado campus the night prior to the game and paint some AFA wins signs in and around the Colorado Stadium. Bad idea. The Colorado University cops caught us, recorded our Air Force Academy identification, gave us a lecture, and sent us on our way. Well, now we were delayed and unlikely to get back in time for Reveille. We'd be marked absent and required to truthfully explain our absence, but we had to return the borrowed cars to the local farmer's field and run up 5 miles uphill at 7,000 feet above sea level to be in formation for Reveille. Needless to say, we were about 5 minutes late. That's probably a little exaggeration. But our academy football team won the game, so good outcome. But wait, what about being late for Reveille? Well, they were restricted to Class 3 disciplinary board accused of being absent without orders. Their penalty was 3 months confined to quarters and march tours. But in the meantime, Bob and Pat were able to get to know each other better, so their chess skills improved greatly. Their grades improved to a level that were excused from the end of the semester electrical engineering exam and one other subject. And Bob smuggled some beer and parked it in a mountain stream a few hundred meters up in the western mountains. So we passed the final exam in the mountains with cold beers and Colorado sunshine, studying for the finals. Except in our final academic year, our higher electrical engineering grades put us up into section 1 for astro and aero. But after a month of quizzes, we got reassigned to an average level section and continued on graduation in June of '61. A little bit of that flipping around levels and grades. Fast forward 30 years or so, Pat is living in Maryland and Bob is in Baker City. Pat has a week of meetings with subcontractors in North California and an opportunity to fly in and out with weekend break. Call Bob. Set up weekend at Mount Hood with stay at local hotel in Foothills. Meet Judy, Bob got lucky. Don't comment on that. Friday, Pat drives to Baker City. Bob goes rooming for edible delights, check in at a local hotel, looking south along the mountain chain, breakout steaks, edible mushrooms, are we sure? And cold beers. Must have been springtime. Right in front of us, in 100 yards or so, we saw 2 eagles training a young one. What a view. Great spring ski weekend. Some years later, Pat's going to show Maryland similar views of the Great Northwest. Call Bob. Bob meets Maryland. Pat got lucky. Planned spring ski weekend at Bob's local Anthony Lake ski mountain. Just the right difficulty level for us old folks. As Meryl and I are discussing not making this too challenging for Bob, Bob disappears over the edge and is almost out of sight. We caught him and did not discuss wait for Bob anymore. So Bob was a wonderful friend, greatly missed. Goodbye, your roommate, Pat Buckley. I can attest to that skiing. I went skiing several times with Bob. And boy, it was a trick to keep up with him. He was outriggers and away he goes. It was a lot of fun.
All right, so now if there is anyone who'd like to just offer a recollection or a thought, memory about Bob, if you'd like to invite anybody to come up. If you could come to the mic, that would be best.
This is being broadcast to my sisters in Portland and a few other people. That's what we're doing.
Well, this is a tough act to follow, but anyway, I went to school with Bob. Unfortunately, my first memory of him, even though we were in 9th grade, when he left the academy, I don't remember him. But I do remember in my junior year, I wasn't in Baker during my sophomore year. And the main reason I remember him at that time was we both were in every math and science class that was offered. Bob was in those classes by choice. I, on the other hand, was in those same classes by my dad's choice. My class schedule for my junior and senior year was determined by my dad, which is very irritating. I might add that I was automatically grounded if my report cards didn't measure up to his expectations. I lived in Haines. I didn't have a way to get home. I didn't have a way to get out of Haines after school. And so I rode the bus from Haines to Baker, got on the bus at night. Anyway, that let me emphasize that if you live in Haines in those days, and you were in high school age and grounded for any reason, you're grounded. My wife and I, Cheryl, she's over there, we moved back to Baker when I retired in 2004. And a short time later, Bob started the weekly coffee get-together, which was started out as a handful of classmates. And a couple of them are here today, Vern Goller, Larry Skeen. I think that's about it that I saw. Anyway, Lisa Britton from the Baker City Herald, she visited the coffee club during one session and wrote an article for the paper. And that contributed to an increase in number of classmates that were visiting in town, and they showed up for coffee. Bob found out I had skied before, and he offered me a one-time free pass to Anthony Lakes. I had no idea where he acquired it from, but I took him up on the offer. And Bob, it said here, and once we made that first trip, we were up there once a week. Anyway, I accepted that offer, and Bob had a special setup that allowed him to ski, and I never once saw him fall. And the reason I know that is because I was almost always behind him as we descended the mountain. On one of our weekly trips, we found ourselves on the chairlift with Peter Johnson, and he's the manager. He's still the manager, as far as I know, up at Anthony Lakes Resort. Well, that chair up there accommodates 3 people, and we were the 3 people that were on there. So with a short ride up the hill, we quizzed him as to why they didn't offer free skiing for people over 70, seeing as I know some resorts did. Lo and behold, they did do it. And we like to think that it was because of Bob and I on that short chair ride up the hill. I think that is still in effect, but I don't know. I haven't skied in a number of years. My skiing ended when I hurt my knee, which required surgery, and as I remember, Bob finished that season and then donated his equipment. As far as the mushrooms, that's been mentioned several times. He was an avid mushroom hunter, and he knew the common and the scientific names of most, if not all, of the edible and poisonous mushrooms in Northeast Oregon. Our family, when I was a kid, we picked only morels. I didn't really know any of the other names of any of them, but that's the only ones we picked. Bob and I hunted mushrooms up at Marble Creek, Pilcher Creek Reservoir, Dutch Flat Lake Trailhead, and around our cabin up Rock Creek. When Cheryl and I would stumble on a plentiful harvest at the cabin, when that was rare. We've had that cabin for many, many years. But I think in the years that we've been back, there's only 3 years where we've actually picked quite a few. She would always suggest that we stop by and share with Bob and Judy. The North Potter School started an annual halibut feed several years ago that raised money for the girls' sports programs. We found out about this event through our State Farm agent when he offered us tickets. Turns out the lady that worked in his office, he's no longer here in Baker, but she was deathly ill of salmon. And they felt that some of the halibut that they picked up, and they used to go, I think they went to Portland or Seattle to buy it had been contaminated with salmon, and she would never touch it again. So we ended up with the tickets that year, and from that year on, we always hit the halibut feed. If you're not aware of it in Baker and in Haines and North Powder, it's tough to get seafood. The following will conclude my remembrance of Bob. Several years ago, Cheryl had gone to Kelso for a few days to visit our son. I drove by Bob and Judy's, and there was Bob in the front yard staring at a huge mess left by the falling of a tree. They had a tree in their front yard, and I don't know what the diameter was, but it was huge, and it was in trouble. And they had a guy cut it down. And I had him cut several trees for us down up at our cabin. And I'm sure once he got into that with his saw, he was sorry he started, because there was only a ring of wood around the outside perimeter. The rest of it looked like garden potting soil. Anyway, what happened was I stopped and I offered to help him with the cleanup, and he accepted my offer. I went home, returned with our dump trailer, the tractor, and a chainsaw. We cut the longer branches to fit in the trailer, and when the limbs were above the side, Bob suggested that we load a large portion of the tree trunk on top of the limbs. The tractor had a bucket grapple, which allowed me to pick up this, and we estimated that it weighed about 500 pounds. We placed it on top of the limbs and then chained it down and off to the dump. Upon arriving at the dump, we were informed that the dump only accepted smaller pieces of wood. I'm still not sure to this day if the attendant felt sorry for the old guys, but we were told to dump it on the brush pile and they would figure out what to do with it. So we made 2 more trips, and however, while we were doing that day, Vern Goler drove by and he had a restored Ford pickup. And we thought, well, geez, it's empty. Why didn't he haul some into the dump? He declined, wouldn't do it. And then later on, Vern had a tree that he cut down for his sister who lived over by a Brooklyn school, if you're familiar with that. But he was a logger for years. His dad was a logger. Anyway, he cut it into chunks and they were too heavy to lift. So I took our dump trailer and tractor over, and we loaded everything onto the trailer and proceeded to the dump. They would not take it. They absolutely refused. So I thought at the time that if Bob and I had showed up with that load, we might have had a different outcome. I left the trailer with a load of wood at Vern's property on 15th Street with the understanding I would be back the next day, and one or two things was going to happen. I was either going to dump it there, or he better have a place to put it. Anyway, I had many memories of Bob. They're all fond.
Anyone else?
Judy? All right.
You remember that? You remember that day you drove by Heriza's and we had the tree cut down? Yeah. And you were in your pickup, you wouldn't take a load to the dump for us. Yeah.
She had started getting it, well, it was still coming.
Hello. Testing. Well, I first met Bob when we were like grade school and his grandmother lived across the street. And I always accused him of coming down and terrorizing our nice, quiet neighborhood. But then he came to the public schools at 9th grade, and it seemed that we played tricks on each other quite a bit. Our class was kind of that way. And so one day, Dick, Roy, and Bob were pestering me, and I took their algebra books and threw them out the window right before class. And so then I locked the window. And coming in late to class at that stage of the game was serious stuff. So they came in looking kind of sheepish, and of course, there was an unspoken pact that you never told on anybody, you just took what happened. But you got even. And waiting for that to happen was never real peaceful. Anyway, so they were sent to the office. Then the next day, and they went outside because it was nice, or the PE class was outside, so they went and shot baskets in the gym all during that period. The next day, that class period had an assembly, and they were honoring the best students, and of course, both of them were getting honors, and there was never any repercussions about coming to class late for them. So anyway, life went along, and I didn't see Bob for years after high school until our 25th reunion. And the buzz around was, you're never gonna recognize him. Well, I sure didn't. And so we went, and I met Bob, and so he said, or we were just talking, we got acquainted, he said, sit down, I'll buy you a drink. And I put my big purse on the table, because I don't like to put them on dirty floors. And so he said, he grabbed it and said, is this your purse? And I said, oh yeah. Started to take it from him. Well, he didn't let me, he hurried out and threw it out on the sidewalk. So I waited, he came in, and he said, for 29 years, see, our 25th reunion and in the 9th grade, I carried a grudge. And now we're even. And I responded, I put my hands on my hips, and that really ticks me off. A couple of classmates thought I was serious. I said, for 29 years, you carried a grudge, and I haven't had the pleasure of knowing. So, he bought me a drink. And then he stayed in town for a while visiting the family, of course, after the reunion. And we went out a couple times and had a drink. And then he went back to Colorado, decided to move to Baker. So he did, and we started going out for a drink, just casual. And it was like, old classmates. That was it. But the conversation came up that he brought up rather soon, that he was never going to remarry. And he was adamant about it. Well, I was just as adamant about it that I had absolutely no interest in ever marrying again. So we started off with no goals, just having a good time. And as we would go out in public and see people, we started noticing how many people who were married weren't really nice to each other. And we had a term for it. They were licensed to be naughty to each other. And it kind of evolved where, we talk about how life was and should be, and we thought that was pretty silly to argue. And so we never did. Except one time we had an argument, and then we decided to quit seeing each other. Well, actually, no. Bob decided that we wouldn't see each other. And so that went on for, I don't know, maybe a week or two, and he came back and said, "Changed my mind." And so we did a lot of things. Of course, we went mushrooming. If you knew Bob, you went mushrooming with Bob. And we just had a good time. And when he first came back, he, of course, didn't have a job. And I had my decorating business, and that time, it was my early stage in that, and I did work like hanging wallpaper, upholstering, painting. And so I got jobs painting houses out on the exterior, and because I like being outside. Well, so Bob helped me, we painted houses. And we just kind of did whatever and had a great time. And then he decided one day that we should get married. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And so we did, and I don't know if you noticed the picture of the helicopter. And so we went to Vegas, and we went to one chapel, they called it, and it was just a big empty room, and nothing at all interesting about it. And we talked to the lady there, and Bob said, well, this would be a really nice room. I wouldn't mind having my funeral here. But it isn't what I had in mind. That was one person who didn't appreciate his sense of humor. So we went back to our room, and I was looking. I hadn't even looked before we went to see what shows were on. I was looking to see what was going on, and I saw this ad, and I said, good grief, you can even get married in a helicopter here. And it was like, can I catch these words before they get to that old pilot? And so he's, let me see that. And so he looked, and I said, no way. And so he said, I'm going to go down and talk to them. So he did. He came back all excited. He said, now, will you go down with me? And so I said, okay. Well, it turned out to be a lovely experience. Just the two of us had gone to Vegas because we wanted to get married. We both had the big weddings and done that, been there. This was what we wanted to do. And so they came, they picked us up in a limo. They took us down to get our license. We walked past a really long line of couples waiting, and it took like 5 minutes. And then we were in the helicopter, and it flew over the strip, and we were quite a ways above it, so all we saw were twinkling lights. And there was a minister, and so then when we said our vows, we were to the place where the pilot's area, that was all he could fly and had to turn. But when he did that, he kind of paused, and when we did our I-do's, he like set us back in our seat a little, with like a punctuation mark on that. And as we said our vows, Bob had tears running down his cheek. It was a very nice, personal experience for us. And forever on and on. Life was great. We never had another fight. We respected each other. We knew that we were entitled to our viewpoints, and that was fine. We didn't have to agree on everything. And we didn't. And he would do things like he'd be on his computer a lot. And so then I'd go, it was just off the kitchen, and I'd go in the kitchen and he'd say, "Oh, my darling." He would just acknowledge my presence, and that was it. Sometimes it'd be a little longer, and he'd sing of, "Oh, my darling," and he'd say, "What's her name?" And then he'd say, "I don't know why they named her Flo." And that's just Bob's sense of humor. And he'd say, "Flo, ho, ho." And I'd say, "No, no." We were very simple people living a very simple, full life. And I sure miss him. Thank you.
I wanted to finish with something Bob wrote. Bob kept writing. He wrote some things he self-published. He wrote some things that were published, like the little thing about the Langleys, which is worth looking up, by the way, because the part about catching the horse was only half of it. The part about the rattlesnake was actually the more dramatic part. But so he wrote about his own experience a lot. And Judy found this in some of his papers. We don't know if it was published or submitted or not, but I felt like it was quite appropriate for this moment. And it's entitled "Kill Deer." Shh, don't tell anyone I wrote this. I'm writing it about my dad, and I don't want him to find out about it. It's funny, I want him to know about it, but then I don't want him to know about it. Confusing? Well, you gotta be here. I'm a writer, which means I love to write. I haven't published much of anything, but I write. I love to write about what interests me, not what I think magazines want. The reason I'm writing this is because I suddenly had a realization, what James Joyce called an epiphany. It happened the other day when I was watching my dad taking out the garbage. My mind says to me, what if he doesn't come back? What if he has a heart attack or something and just keels over? How would I feel? How would I take all of it? I've been thinking about it, and I'm going to write it down. My dad and I go back a long ways. Of course, he goes back a lot further than I do for obvious reasons, but what I mean is that he's getting on in years, and he's almost 80. I'm 45. When I look back on my life, which has been full of a lot of successes, I realize that I owe much of it to him. I don't mean just because he was the cause of me being conceived and born, but because he taught me almost everything I know. From the time I was very little, he used to show me things. We'd be out working on our little farm planting vegetables, and we'd see a gopher or a snake or some kind of bird making a nest. My dad would stop and talk to me about whatever it was. Come to think of it, he was always saying, "Look here," or "See that?" or "Come see this." And I think that's why I tend to see and appreciate what goes on around me, and always have. Little things, like an ant crawling somewhere, or a bird flying, or a super sunrise or sunset. Dad taught me how to drive a tractor, milk a cow, plant a hill of corn. One kernel for the birds, one for the bugs, one for the mold, and one to grow. How to irrigate a field, sneak up on a killdeer, and try to find her nest. My dad could do a great killdeer. The killdeer, for those of you who don't know, is a bird like a plover or a sandpiper that builds its nests in areas where there's a lot of insect activity, like gardens or potato patches. When it's laid its eggs, it does a funny thing to keep potential predators, like man or other animals, from finding its nest. When someone or something gets too near its nest, the bird gives out a hurt peeping and thrashes around in the dirt like it has a broken wing. When the man or animal tries to catch the killdeer, which is a natural thing to do, the bird flops away from its nest. After the predator is far enough away from the nest, the bird suddenly gets well and flies away with a chatter that says, "I fooled you." I swear, if you didn't know that the bird was conning you, you'd think its wing was broken, the way it thrashes around. Well, my dad could do a tolerable impression of the frightened peeping a killdeer made, but what got me was the way he could imitate the thrashing the bird did with its wing by waving his arms around and peeping like the bird. It really got me when he did that. Yeah, he did a lot. It's his best act. From my dad, I learned how to find my way to the forest, how to find my way in a forest by looking for the moss that grows on the north side of the trees, and how to find mushrooms, the morel and the calf brain, or the snowbank mushroom, which is the tastiest one I've ever eaten. He taught me respect for all of God's creatures, most of all my fellow man. He always saw the good in even the worst appearing person we met. And he always did what he could to help someone in trouble or down on his luck. Once, even though he only went to school through the 8th grade, he explained the atomic theory to me, and he didn't use a lot of fancy words and things. He explained it so that when my teachers in school talked about it, I immediately understood what they were talking about. Yes, my dad has, in a way, made me everything I am, and I like what he made. That's why the other day, when I looked at him taking out the garbage, I got that flash of love and respect and reverence. In answer to the question of what I would do if he's no longer here, I know that I'd feel a great loss. But he'll never be gone for me, you see, because whenever I run my fingers through the soil as I'm planting something, or when I see a sunset, or find a mushroom, or see the moss on the north side of a tree, or see a killdeer trying to con me from her nest, he'll be there, beside me for sure. So, that's our tribute to Brother Bob. But for those of you who'd like to socialize, we can hang around here a little bit, and then we're going to have a little event at the corner of 1st and Court Street, 1933 Court. You're welcome to stop by and have a bite and continue with us. So, thank you all very much.
My name is Richard.